Well, this week's guest on The Art of Complexity is Major General retired William Grimsley of the United States Army. This was a privileged time for me to do this interview with this individual who I've gotten to know him over the last several years, who actually had the privilege of serving with in my last assignment in the United States Army. But what was so unique about our conversation is that we really kind of dove into those personal relationships throughout our professional lives. It really helped form the ethos we have as leaders in complex environments. So lean in with me today as we dive in with Major General William Grimsley in The Art of Complexity.
Welcome to the Art of Complexity podcast, where we explore how people and organizations understand and tackle the most complex challenges they face on a day-to-day basis. Simply put, how they think and act beyond. If you or your organization faces a challenge that seems to just be unsolvable, then you're in the right place. Now, here's your host, Roy Adams.
Well, welcome to this episode of The Art of Complexity. I'm very excited today to have with us Major General retired William Grimsley of the United States Army. Just a brief introduction, as you heard in the introduction, more about his bio, but General Grimsley is an infantryman by training, but is also a strategic thinker, and then has done a lot in his life, both professionally and personally, around the whole idea of complexity. So I'm really excited today to have General Retired Grimsley. And I know he's not going to let me keep calling him that, but I'm going to introduce him that way to begin with. So General Grimsley, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So to kind of start off with this, I like to kind of set the stage for our listeners about something in your past that may have been an experience or a person who really impacted the way you think and approach not only your professional, but maybe even your personal life, that was very formative in your early years of your adulthood or even your professional career. Has anything come to mind right away that as I ask that question?
Yeah, and actually, I would go back way before my professional life. So I had the extraordinary benefit of growing up in one of those families that took great pride in learning and reading and talking and debating and discussing, and dinner tables were always very lively at my house. And I'm the last of three children. My brother and sister are both 12 and 8 years older than me, respectively. So while I didn't have them really after the fourth grade at home, I sort of had a second separate childhood from my parents, which was great. I got a lot of personal attention. Not so great when I was a teenager, I guess. But my dad and mom were big time readers, avid readers, and lifelong learners. And we're always very open, even though it was a very structured household. And my dad also an Army officer, Army general officer, a plenty strict disciplinarian in his own right. Always wanted us to spend a lot of time thinking and talking and trying out ideas, even over the dinner table or some other ways. And so that built in me, I didn't really get it at the time, but it built in me this idea that the more you could learn about more different things and share those ideas over time with other people, perhaps the better, more well-rounded you would be. So make a leap forward there into my academic life as a young undergraduate, and by the way, my backstory plan was never to go in the Army. I didn't want any part of it.
Wow.
But my dad had a rule that both my brother and I had to take ROTC at least the first 2 years of our college for him to pay for it. And so we did. And so I ended up in the Army and then staying in long after that. But I went to a really great small private liberal arts college, Davidson in North Carolina. That is one of those classic liberal arts schools that you find around the world, and certainly in the United States, that doesn't teach you how to think, but prescribes the beauty of the liberal arts education, that you take a wide variety of things, you get really rooted in the humanities and the sciences as a freshman, sophomore, and then you can expand into your major after that. So it wasn't what to think or what to believe. It was how to think, how to express your ideas, how to defend them, and how to build a better body of knowledge. I really didn't appreciate just how great a gift I had gotten up to the point where I did transition into being a professional soldier at age 22, until I got in there and was suddenly faced with people and things I never imagined I would encounter. So my ability to sort of think through problems, or at least gather information, do some back of the envelope cursory analysis, and then try and come to some workable solutions that I could present to people and build a body of knowledge, I believe was the most important formative part of it, certainly my upbringing and my education. Then couple that with the experiences of things like scouts and sports and, life experiences in college and beyond. And over time, my professional military life for 30 plus years. And, I attribute all of those things to getting me to where I am today.
Well, it's amazing how similar that part of our lives stories are. My father had a 30-year Army career, as yours had probably a much longer one, but he had a similar type of family value that we should serve our country for a period of time as young men in our family. So I truly appreciate, and I can even remember those conversations with my father. It was never about this is what you have to do with your life. It was about this is a season in which you owe your country something. For the privilege of what we have. And so I really appreciate that value that is such a formative point of your life. I also think about my early career in the U.S. Army as a soldier, and I think about those non-commissioned officers. And for our listeners, that's the senior experienced soldier who comes alongside the young new officer and helps them in the unit leadership of their particular organization. But do you recall any particular experienced soldier who came alongside you early and really helped form your kind of leadership ethos?
I had two of them, both platoon sergeants. Platoon, for those of you who aren't military folk, 30 plus soldiers, enlisted soldiers, you're the only commissioned officer. And my very first one was a guy named Leo Munoz, 3-tour Vietnam veteran, infantryman, just one of those classic non-commissioned officers. And that was in my very first rifle platoon, 32, 33 guys. He was my senior sergeant, sergeant first class, so relatively senior. And I had 3 other NCOs, 3 other non-commissioned officers in that group, all of whom were buck sergeants. I had no staff sergeant. I had one staff sergeant. But what was really interesting about this group is, and this is 1981, so we're at the very beginning of the modern volunteer force, the modern volunteer army. And about a quarter or more of my platoon could barely read or write, not high school graduates. It was a really different army.
Yeah.
And very different from what we have today. And I really relied on Sergeant Munoz and those non-commissioned officers to grow me. Because I thought I knew everything, and in reality, I really knew nothing about leading soldiers, and knew a lot about other things. But what, back to that whole backstory experience thing, is I think I came into it much like we all do, very prideful at first, and then realized very quickly that I was the least experienced guy in that crowd, although I was in charge. And so this idea of having conversation and grappling with challenges and building my body of knowledge through the experience of other people was just huge. And then I changed jobs a couple of times and I ended up in the support platoon, which in an infantry battalion is an odd duck because you unlike the truck drivers and the cooks and the fuel guys and it's this mishmash of stuff that is a challenge all its own, but it's what makes the rest of the unit go. Mm-hmm. And I had a really tremendous platoon sergeant there too. Also a real long-serving, multiple combat tour in Vietnam kind of guy who then helped me bring a harder edge to the softer skilled guys in the support platoon, but without being overbearing or trying to turn them into infantrymen. And I don't know. It's just, and then over time, I just had the continued benefit of experience. I don't have a huge ego about a lot of things, but I'm really proud that in my military career, even as a general officer, that I'm really an officer who's raised by his sergeants. They made the most profound impact on me of anybody.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well. I I think I didn't even think of that question until you started talking about your backstory, and it just reflected on my own experience as well. So, we could spend a lot of time in how do you summarize your 30-year career in 5 minutes or so. But just for our listeners, you progressed pretty normally, I guess, in the Army.
Yeah.
Would that be fair?
Yeah, I was a due course guy. I wasn't selected early for anything until I got to colonel. It's the first time I was ever selected early for anything.
And as a colonel, you moved into this time in our nation's history that has been very profound and very much in the forefront of probably almost all of our listeners' lives, and that's post 9/11,
Yeah,
and into a time of conflict.
I was stationed in Washington. I was assigned to the Pentagon, and just for a very unusual reason, I wasn't in the building on 9/11, the morning the plane hit. I was actually at a meeting a block from the White House, and an Army officer, I was the Army officer, and Naval officer and Air Force officer and I were together, and we watched the smoke coming from the Pentagon, and we helped count people out of the building, make sure they were safe, and then we made our way back, and then eventually made it home. And I went to work the next morning on the 12th of September, literally in a building that was on fire, and we all knew at that point that our lives were going to be very, very different from that point forward.
Yeah, my own story of that day is I was a brand new father. Had about a 10-month-old baby girl, and I walk out. I lived in Colorado at the time. I was at Fort Carson, Colorado, and I get out in my truck, and obviously the first tower had been hit by then, and the radio's going crazy, and I stop, and I'm like, oh man. And so I walk back into the house, and I tell my wife, turn on the TV, and about that point in time, the second plane hit. And I think I turned to my wife and I said, I'm going to work. We're going to war. I don't know what that looks like, and I'll see you sometime soon.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that realization as a professional soldier that you knew our time had come. We didn't want it, but we knew it had come, and we had a mission to do then. So maybe let me fast forward a little bit, and if you would like to talk about this, you can. But you were a brigade commander into one of the infantry units that went into the invasion into Iraq. But then later, you went back to Iraq and served in multinational division Baghdad,
right,
as the deputy commander. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I was a brigade, almost 18 months to the day, or 18 months and a few change from the day the plane hit. We were starting the invasion in Iraq. I was a colonel level commander and had the lead brigade combat team across the border in the invasion on the Army side, with Marine counterparts on the right side, on the other side of the river, and then came back after the fight and some subsequent time there, and I on redeployment stayed, trained the brigade up, and then they went back 6 months after I gave up command. I went back to the Pentagon for a few years and then selected for brigadier while there, and to the 4th Infantry Division in Fort Hood, Texas, and then deployed about 6 months later in the middle of the surge period back into Baghdad. And I was the deputy commander for operations there for the division. So about 40,000 soldiers, plus or minus.
Let's camp around this for a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Maybe because the whole theme of this podcast is how do we understand that you're in a complex situation? What is it? What does it look like? And then how did you navigate it? So maybe for our listeners, just set up kind of what was the complex challenge that the division was facing in Baghdad at the pre-surge to right when the surge happened, to kind of set the stage for us.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think everybody remembers in the sort of the 2005-06 period, things were really terrible there. Just a whole host of things that erupted over time. We were having the coalition forces, U.S. predominantly, were having huge challenges in our stability operations, which is a nice term for really trying to keep things moving, keep the political process going, but at the same time, keep those who are fighting against us at bay, protect the government of Iraq to try and, help them get their legs underneath them. We were losing a lot of soldiers. The Army and the Marine Corps, to some extent, had really sort of gone back into really big bases and then forayed out on periodic times. And then the decision, rightly so, was to let's get everybody back out where they belonged, out in and amongst the population, really trying to influence hearts and minds while still keeping combat operations going, to tamp down the various insurgency and then continue on. And so what we found about 6 months into the surge, and we took over from our friends in the 1st Cavalry Division, also from Fort Hood, and they had been fighting a hard fight there. We got into Baghdad right around Thanksgiving of 2007, and in Baghdad province, so that's the city as well as the outlying agricultural areas, they're not really suburbs like we would think, but the outlying villages and everything else. It's a big area, a huge area, and about 120 to 150 attacks a day, something that was kinetic. So explosions, IEDs, rifle fire, grenade fire, rockets, whatever, about 120 to 150 a day. That's what we took over in. And we were partnered with 6 Iraqi division-sized units, federal police, national police then, as well as Army in and around the province. One big operational command headquarters, which had a 3-star to 4-star equivalent Iraqi general officer. And our job, in addition to taking on lethal operations unilaterally, was also partnership, building up the Iraqi security forces, which is everything from beat, patrol cops all the way up through the federal and national police and their various arms, and as well as the Iraqi army, to help provide advice and consent and oversight to them, conduct combined operations with Iraqi forces. And we were also doing a whole lot of micro and macroeconomic support. We were dealing with the federal, provincial, city government, obviously in coordination with multinational corps and Force Iraq, the military side, but also the embassy. We had stability, provincial stability and support teams out there trying to help us facilitate those things, whether they were State Department, USAID, a lot of non-governmental organizations. And then, of course, we have this amorphous group of people who are loyal to, whatever their tribe or clan is, their village, sort of quasi-militias. That's all on the good guy side, so to speak.
Yeah.
Good guy, I say, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But on the enemy side, and this is where I think most people don't really perhaps get fully the challenge that not just a guy like me faces, but it's actually heightened the lower down you go. So, young sergeants and lieutenants out there on street corners and hilltops are facing this every day. And where the complexity really lies is on the enemy side. So, you've got and I'll try and be as simplistic as possible, but you've got the, Al-Qaeda and Iraqi, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the sort of Sunni fomented insurgencies from the Sunni half or part of Islam. And that doesn't mean they're all very religious. They could be very secular, but they generally follow the Sunni line. But then you go on the Shia side, and you've got those that are directly supported by, other governments, particularly Iran. Some are tied to Lebanese Hezbollah. Some are tied to Syria. Some are just independent of their own, Muqtada al-Sadr's Jaish al-Mahdi. And then you've got all these other splinter groups of people that all are fighting against us. Sometimes they fight against themselves, and they rarely all get along. And so picking apart the pieces of, who you're fighting, when you're fighting, it's just, that's just tactical complexity. Then you heap the strategic complexity of the government of Iraq, and whatever relationships they have, not only with the United States and Great Britain and others, but other countries in the region. And it's just this big, giant ball of, wow, it's a Gordian knot.
Yeah. So for our listeners, you've done a great job, I think, of just painting a picture of almost so complex that you feel like you can't do anything.
Yeah, and that's the challenge with complexity. And if it's okay, Roy, I'll give you an example.
Sure, please.
So fast forward about 6 or 8 months into this, and we're about 6 months in country now. And we determined that the Al-Qaeda fomented insurgency was the most dangerous threat to us, and therefore our main effort was tamping them down. And we really heavily focused on that. I mean, very kinetic operations. And I, as the deputy commander for operations, my boss gave me responsibility and authority to direct, lead, support, resource all kinetic operations in Baghdad province, lethal operations, kill capture.
Mm-hmm.
And we had 7 U.S. ground maneuver brigades, 2 aviation brigades, a whole host of support units, engineers doing route clearance, and it's a big crowd. And I had a counterpart on the other side who was doing the non-lethal operations, which are equally, if not oftentimes more important, things like micro and macroeconomics, support, in and amongst the various governmental agencies, non-governmental things, really enabling those networks through soft power kinds of things that make the rest of this so incredibly important in that kind of environment. So, and we were close friends, and it was a good pair, and we really had a pretty good team going on. But in the midst of really focused and hard, didn't mean we weren't fighting other people. And there was this huge uprising amongst the Shia militia, started in Basra down south, moved to Baghdad. And then Prime Minister Maliki, also a Shia, really came down hard on them and tamped it down. And so we shifted back and had to shift back and forth, put a lot of time and energy into helping support the Iraqi security forces really take on their own complex challenge. But in the midst of this, where I spent a lot of time, and maybe this will help put this into perspective of complexity, is those militias, those amorphous group of people who were very skilled, tenacious fighters, but loyal only to their own familial group by name or demographic location, and very isolated. The coalition had been fighting them for 4 years now, because in many cases they were fomented and supported by Al-Qaeda infiltrators who kept saying, hey, look, that government in Baghdad, they're all Shia, they're going to come take your land, they're going to rape your women, they're going to steal your children, everything. Yeah. They're never going to let you have any power. And they had been tough for us. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden, the Al-Qaeda sort of undermined their own credibility by being incredibly vicious amongst the populations. And they turned against Al-Qaeda and helped get rid of them. But now all of a sudden we still have these group of armed young men, mostly young men, led by their tribal clan, leaders, the sheikhs, who are very disenfranchised. They're young men who have guns, lots of ammunition, and are angry. They have no jobs, they have no money. That culture, they therefore have no honor, no money, no job, no honor, no family. No family, you're not a real man. It's just an interesting challenge. And so, and our Marine friends in Anbar were great partners in this too. Anbar province, which is, west of Baghdad, a huge Sunni stronghold. And our borders touched each other. And so we started working together to bring these young men in from the cold. And by doing that, we not only provided them advisors and kept them out of trouble, but we started using our own money, government money, to pay them. A pittance salary compared to what we're used to. Mm-hmm. But it gave them a job. It gave them something important to do. So the complexity of this is that now all of a sudden we have armed Sunni resistance fighters who have been fighting the government now on our side that we are paying to continue to be armed, and they're manning checkpoints, they're providing security, but they rub right up against Iraqi security forces who ostensibly have come in on their own, raised their hands to support and defend the government of Iraq, be loyal to the government, to the flag, and now who's providing the security? And just one minor example, because of the name that was derived, unfortunately, by Americans for these groups of people, they were called Abnal Iraq, Sons of Iraq.
Yeah.
And I vividly remember walking into a meeting at the Baghdad Operations Command with all of my counterparts in the Iraqi army. Everybody exchanges pleasantries like always. We have our chai tea, and we sit down, and immediately one of the division commanders stands up right in front of me, slams his hands on the desk, and in Arabic first, but then he realized, my translator was there, but he couldn't keep up. So he switches to English and said, how dare you call them the Sons of Iraq? Are we not also sons of Iraq?
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Well, yes, in fact, you are. And, then I get a 30-minute lecture from him and others. But, it just raises that challenge that people go. So I'll shut up there for a minute and let you, because I know there's a question coming. So
there probably is a ton of questions I could go out of this whole situation. But I think one of the things that I would ask, and you kind of alluded to it here, is, when we're trying to frame a problem within complexity, we have to take some shortcuts, I guess, if you will, on how to understand it. But we also have to understand our own cultural, maybe organizational bias that may affect that initial problem framing, and then ultimately how we decide to deal with the complex situation. You just alluded to one that, we may as individuals have recognized, but we didn't as an institution, so to speak.
yeah.
And that's not really fully understanding our partners in this, and that was the Iraqi security forces, whatever war, and how they viewed this endeavor that they were taking on. I remember very similar type, not that high level. It was with the 5th Iraqi Army Division, and one of their brigade commanders. But it was a very similar type of conversation. So I think at almost the same point in time. But I guess I want to ask, how did you lead your planning staff, your operations staff, even your subordinate units, in really trying to frame out the immediate problem, but also the second, third order effects that were coming about as we were navigating this at this point in time in the war effort? How did you deal with these cultural biases that we were really stumbling onto and not really thinking about as an institution? At least, maybe individually we were, but I don't know if we were as an institution.
Yeah. So, and we can be guilty of a lot of things, and one of them is our cultural bias. And we oftentimes just come in and approach this, hey, look, just trust us. We really know what we're doing. You just got to make a leap of faith, and we're going to go in this together. And eventually you can get there. So what we tried to do, and to some pretty good, reasonable success over time, but not without its challenges, is it's almost like you have to revert to first principles and go back to okay, what are we really trying to accomplish here? And what's the big, broad overview of this, the kaleidoscope of the landscape across all the pieces, not just the physical terrain, but the human terrain as well, and try and develop as deep and broad a picture as you can of that first. And so what I asked subordinate commanders to do, and the staff, is, let's figure out the landscape here and what it really means. And then immediately, rather than going to oh, holy cow, we don't really know this, we don't know this, we're going to run up against this, let's find where we do have common ground amongst us, the U.S. and the coalition forces. But more importantly, where do we have common ground with these various factions, on at least the good guy side, or ostensibly the good guy side, with, what we're trying to face. So in this case, where do we have common ground? We all want security for our local areas. We all want the security so that, our kids and our families aren't going to be hurt. We all want security so that we can continue to try and push forward, or at least preserve the status quo at worst, some sort of economic development, so that we can create those opportunities for jobs and a little bit of cash and more stability in living and basic human services like electricity and clean water. So if we can come to where we have common ground, then we can at least start to piece together how we develop solutions over time. And I'm a firm believer in this, this, I'm a firm believer in this idea of design as a means to counteract complexity. Because if you look at this just get back to the Gordian knot, this elephant, and try and eat it all at one time, you're never going to get there. So the idea of taking iterative steps, starting with common, points of commonality, and then building over time, and we're going to have failures. I'm a big fan of take action, fail often, fail fast, fail often. but don't do the same failure twice. So that you can start to see successes, and then, then exploit the success in a good way, not bad exploitation, but exploit success by building on that success. If you got a young Iraqi officer out there, or, sergeant, who's figured out how to have a reasonably civil conversation with some militia guy out there, and they're providing security together, they figured out how to do it, even if they will never love each other. That's at least that's a modicum of success on which you can build.
I think I heard kind of three big things there, three kind of ideas, and you talked about this whole idea of first principles, but I heard you talking about really trying to figure out the whole landscape, and you did that holistically through what we called the Army design methodology, finding the common ground and purpose between the different stakeholders that are out there, and then be okay with small, simple steps into the solution space that you can all agree upon, and then take kind of see what's successful and what's not.
Yeah. And you got to keep your eye, it's important. I mean, small successes are very important, but ultimately you got to keep your eye on the big prize. What is it we're really trying to achieve strategically? And that transcends Iraq. That's in anything in life. What's the end goal? And how do you work your way backward to develop a program that can build on those successes over time to achieve in stride, objectives, and knowing that you're not going to always be successful. I mean, that's just fact.
So when you think about that experience and those small successes that you started to have, what do you recall of any particular story that would resonate to maybe a different situation, not combat operations in Iraq, because that's obviously not the majority of our listeners' personal experience right now, that they could kind of maybe take a lesson away from that story that would help them in the challenge and complex situation they're facing right now?
Well, I mean, I think any of us can find that anywhere in time, through the course of certainly my military experience, now subsequent, post retirement and, working in civilian life, just the opportunity to help influence leaders to be more inclusive, perceptive of what's going on in their organizations and the lives of the people who are within their organizations, while still keeping their eye on a big prize. I had the opportunity to do some consulting work with several organizations, and one in particular, a partner of mine and I, we were with a company, small company, led by a really dynamic young man who he wasn't the CEO, but he was sort of their COO, director of operations, I think his real title was, who brought his salespeople in because they weren't struggling, but they were trying to maintain momentum in a company to really propel it to the next level in terms of their productivity and sales, gaining and sustaining clients over time and the associated revenue, which leads to profit. But at the same time, maintain an ethical view of how to do their business, not undercutting their competition unethically, but really just striving to provide a better product. And they asked us to help them think through challenges that they were having. And we went with them, spent a lot of time with them, and really asked them not only to identify what their challenges were, but what's the leadership culture in this organization? How do you view life? What are your principles and traits, your real values? What is it you're trying to espouse that makes you different, above board different from your competition, that you can use that to market advantage without undermining your principles? And they were really forthright. We spent a couple of days with them, and then took them on a couple 3-day experience to try and introduce them to how other people had faced complexities completely different from theirs, but tried to relate the complexities of one group with another, and use that as a vehicle to really have them talk through their challenge. And at the end of the 3 or 4 days, the most powerful part is this young man, the operations guy, stood up and said, I've really gotten a lot out of this. Here's what I take away from it. But more importantly, here's what I commit to do to achieve our organizational ends ethically, responsibly, rooted in our values, at the same time taking care of our people. And every person, to a woman and man there who was a leader in that organization, stood up and did the same thing. I found that really powerful. And I, on the end, but while still maintaining an operational sense of how we had to get there, but more importantly, they committed to accepting responsibility for doing something about it. So
that's a great story, and I think that's a huge lesson that if you're listening to this and you're facing a complex challenge, it all can start with you. It all can start with your perspective and you owning your own problem and owning that you can be a part of that solution. That's really powerful. So you've had a lot of different experiences in the military. I kind of want to back up, if I can, in time, and ask you a little bit about working at the senior levels of our government as a military assistant to the Secretary of Defense, and maybe just talk about the uniqueness of our institution in this civil military relationship that we have, and how complexity plays out, not just in a personal relationship, but an institutional relationship from at the political level to the operational level, especially in the middle of a combat, at a time of combat and war for our country. Maybe even some ideas about, what's the role of a professional soldier in that regard, and what's the role of our civilian, the civilian leaders that we are placed underneath through our Constitution.
Yeah. So just, truth in lending here, I gave up brigade combat team command as a colonel, as I said, went back to the Pentagon because I needed to fulfill my statutory responsibility to have joint service time as a senior officer. It's a law in order to be ever be considered for flag, general or admiral. And so I was in the joint staff working for the chairman. And in the midst of that, I was selected work for the Secretary of Defense as a military assistant, a nominative job. A bunch of us were nominated, and I was selected. And so I did. So for 19 months, I was Secretary Don Rumsfeld's military assistant. And it wasn't a job I sought. It's just a job I got. But it was fascinating. And so inside a very small office, direct access to the Secretary every day, traveled with him all over the world. And because of the job, I had among responsibilities to do a lot of correspondence, especially very sensitive classified correspondence, and out of his office a lot, with the senior leaders of our government and every other government. So, and on a day, and so it was a fascinating look into the workings of our civil military, national security apparatus government at the absolute highest levels. I mean, it was a privilege in its own right. Every day was a challenge. I won't kid you. For a whole host of reasons. But I came to really appreciate, even if I could differ in an opinion with some of the conclusions that our masters might come to, I came to really appreciate the level of patriotism and the depth, the expertise and knowledge that these women and men bring to their positions, all in service to the nation. And it made so much more sense to me when I was back in the field again, having been in the Joint Staff before, then in the field, then back to the Pentagon, both Joint Staff and the Secretary's office, then back in the field again. When pronouncements come out or proclamations come out or decisions are made, it gave me such a different perspective on how we got to that decision, regardless of whether I agreed with it or not. Because I knew that there had been a significant amount of debate before it ever came to decision.
So from that experience, what would you say you changed the way you thought about leadership as you, or even your own personal belief system that you took with you into that next step when you went back into you became into the General Officer Corps in flag officer rank and then moved into the division leadership back in Baghdad? What was something maybe you took away from that experience?
The whole notion that patience is a virtue. It's not only a virtue, it's a mandate that you really have to have a strong eye on what the real purpose of whatever it is you're doing is. And not only the patience, but the resilience to see it through, no matter how difficult. And so, if you, take it back 150 years, think about the challenges that Abraham Lincoln went through as the president and his cabinet, a challenging group of men back then, to really see that through, perhaps the most trying period in our history to date.
Mm-hmm.
Or, even Ulysses Grant later. I just finished the biography by Ron Chernow of General Grant. And the military parts were interesting, and I knew a lot of it, not all the backstory, but I knew a lot of it. But what interested me the most, what fascinated me the most, was the whole challenges he had to face post-Civil War, both the couple, 3 years still in uniform, but then perhaps even more challenging when he becomes president in 1869, elected in 1868, and the challenges he had to face domestically and internationally to really see things through. Potentially going to war with the United Kingdom, the whole problems with really seeing Reconstruction, try and get to the point where it really was self-sustaining, which it was most of the time he was there, but then later not. The real, trying to see the most important parts of the emancipation of the women and men in servitude, African-American servitude through slavery, and really not only just having them free, but the real full expression of what it means to be free, to be, representatives in Congress and in their local communities, and to have the opportunity and just the actions that a guy like that took. And that's really a strategic view of what's important, but then it transposes down to the most minute actions on the lowest tactical level. So, I took those things away.
Mm-hmm.
But I also came to realize, and perhaps this is what's most challenging about our current situation, is that when people in positions of great power, and the higher up you go, the more power you have, the fewer decisions you should be making, and quite often the less you should be talking. And really, it's more about listening and thinking and getting the best of ideas, and this idea of the wisdom of crowds. And when you make a decision, it's going to have a huge impact. So rather than constantly deciding, everything every day, which is what you do as a young officer or a sergeant, or, pick a job, a foreman on a factory line, when you're at that higher level, you really have to think about what are those big, important things. And it's back to this idea of complexity. Mm-hmm. Nothing is a simple binary choice. Everything is, between A and Z, there are 24 other letters. Well, that's also true of every decision a strategic leader makes. And I probably instinctively thought I knew that before, but as I grew perhaps more senior in military ranks, certainly in, post-military life, and watching, what goes on daily, the more I believe that comes to the forefront.
Wow, that's very powerful. I think that's powerful advice for anybody who's rising up in the quote ranks of their organization, or even if they have a small organization but they're in charge of it. You that less talking, less deciding, and really more listening is a hard skill set for people to grasp, I think, because I think there's an expectation that you have to do to be successful. And in many cases, that may be the worst thing to do, is to continue.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. And it's not that you're indecisive. The beauty is if you make a good, reasonable, cogent decision based on great facts, and then really monitor progress, listen to your people, and make course corrections only when you need to, and empower people below you to take the actions you need to really make the trains run on time the right way, then what you're really doing is not only setting a large long-term course for the future, but you're empowering other people to make decisions and build up their own experience and expertise, and you're building the next you. I mean, that's ultimately the whole point of leadership is not what you got, how many medals you got, or how much rank you have. It's that you grew the next version of you. And so when you step out of that organization, people might say, gosh, I really like that Roy Adams guy. I really miss him. But you know what? There's another 10 guys who are ready to step in and do it because he empowered us to learn. That's the legacy of leadership. It's growing the next version of you.
Oh, that's I think it's a great transition point for us. When you think about your experiences, both in the military and for our listeners now, and if you've heard the bio at the beginning, Will is now the chairman, executive vice president, or executive president, or CEO. I can't remember your term for the
both actually
SAE Foundation.
Yeah, I run a nonprofit foundation,
which is something that I don't know if you thought you would be doing that when you retired from the military or not, but at the end of the day, you seem to have this sense that you're always looking ahead to how you can impact the next generation. You did that as an officer in the military. Truth in lending to our listeners, I've served under General Grimsley, and I can tell you that I always felt empowered by him to not only do my job, but to make the organization better. And that was something that I valued personally, but at the same time, he always challenged us as an organization, and even me personally, to be a better leader than I was at the point in time. So when you think about that, what are some things that you'd like to tell young men at this point in time, because that's the organization you're working with? What's some of the advice you give them, or you would give anyone right now that is entering into their adult life or professional life, or maybe they're transitioning positions or jobs or companies where they are facing that seemingly complex or unsolvable, wicked problem, whatever you'd like to call it? What are some of the things that you would advise them to do, not just to solve the problem, but to be better leaders?
So I think the first one is, and I will, again, back to truth in lending, and I've told plenty of people this, I never felt personally prepared that I was competent enough to do whatever job the Army or the Joint Force sent me to do when I got there. I might have been selected for promotion and, rank and new job and maybe school, but I never really felt that I was that person when I first got there. When I came to realize, however, is the flip side of that, the B side of that, is that I was, not because I'm any better than anybody else, but because I really had been prepared for it. I just didn't know it. That it's additive over time, as long as you're willing to, take on the experience, get that, scar tissue learning, but at the same time, couple it with your education, and put it all together, that I really knew a lot more than I thought I knew. So never devalue your experience, no matter how minute it might seem, because it does build toward the larger body of knowledge. This part of the equation, I think. A second part of the equation is that don't try and be something you're not. So plenty of people who knew me in the Army would tell you that I am not the most military guy in the world. And I'm okay with that, because I always tried to not to be something that I wasn't. And I've watched plenty of people, friends and just acquaintances or colleagues, who tried to adopt a persona that they thought their boss wanted them to adopt. And it's never a good idea, because you can only carry that facade for so long. So, just kind of be who you are, because whatever got you to where you are is what got you to where you are.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for most people to really change their personalities that dramatically. It doesn't mean you can't learn and grow and certainly admit mistakes, or because those are all very important. But don't try and be something you're not, because people will read right through it very quickly.
Sure.
especially younger people who have less filters. They'll read right through it and they'll dismiss you. You will be immediately dismissed. You'll be undermined as a leader because they know that, or at least they believe, they perceive, therefore it's true to them, that you're trying to be something you're not. And so how can they really trust you? Third is trust. I cannot imagine, and I've been in organizations that lacked trust, and those organizations go nowhere. Trust is really all about loyalty that goes in all directions, up, down, left, right, diagonally. Because you build that trust through open communication by being transparent, by empowering people below you, keeping people above you informed, even when it's bad news or something they don't want to hear. And so this idea of trust is extraordinarily important because that's how organizations really grow and learn how to, their operating norm becomes so much more powerful over time. They can just do things better and faster, or more effectively and efficiently, if that's a better way to put it. And I guess the last two parts goes back to where I started this whole thing, is this notion of lifelong learning. I come from a liberal arts background, and I love that approach, that Socratic approach to learning, because it really forces you to think about things. And I'm not a science and math oriented guy, but I found as a matter of fact, I was talking about this with my son earlier today. I have come to become more fascinated with things scientific and mathematical now as I've gotten older, because I don't come by it naturally, but it's so fascinating how that science underpins all of the rest of things, provides order to the world, so to speak. But it really builds this body of knowledge, and becoming a lifelong learner and a questioner and a reader of a lot of things, and a debater, discusser, whatever it is I think really important to not just becoming a better, person in your organization, but just becoming a better person. And the flip side of that is you have to be respectful. You don't have to agree with everybody, but at least listen to building your body of knowledge has to do with this idea of civil discourse and really hashing things out over time. You may never change your mind, but you at least understand that not everybody thinks like you, back to our cultural questions earlier. And then, of course, that leads to my last one, which is, everybody needs some values base on which to build their lives. And, it didn't have to be religious, or it didn't have to come from your family or your organization. We all build our values based on something. And if we can stay rooted in our values and try and live by those every day, which is, what we're trying to do with this organization I raise money for and provide education and scholarship opportunities for young men, then, that at least gives us the hope or the basis on which we can build a stronger, more civil society over time. So that's for what that's worth.
That's worth a lot, I think. There's a lot of meat there. I think that if you're listening to this, you might want to pause and back up and really just kind of take in some of that, because I think your depth of life experience has led you to some of these conclusions. It's just not something that you just kind of pulled out from a book somewhere. This is born out of your personal and professional experiences over a long period of time.
And again, I credit my family. I mean, I started life in a great group of people, my biological parents, who, that's how I was rooted, for what it's worth. And it's and I certainly didn't appreciate it at the time. But I find it, more and more true.
Yeah. I want to thank you for coming on. I kind of want to wrap up a little bit, but I want our listeners to maybe walk away with something that you might recommend very practically they could go do right now. And I like to ask this question to most of our guests, and that's, if there's 1, 2, or 3 books over your lifetime that have made a huge impact on the way you thought or lived through complex challenges, what may that particular book or books be? And then would you recommend for them to read?
Well, I read a lot. And and I read a lot of odd, different things. And I read biographies of people, historical figures, not because I want to try and emulate them, but because there are a lot of life lessons that I mentioned Grant and, Team of Rivals about Lincoln and some of the other, just the Theodore Rex, the biography of Teddy Roosevelt. I found all of those really compelling. I'm reading Tom Friedman's second book, the Thank You for Being Late, that came out either last year or the year before. My sister gave it to me for Christmas last year. I've sort of put off reading it, but I'm reading that now, which is all about, accelerants in life that are really propelling us forward, economics and technology and other things. I'm a huge fan of Starfish and Spider, which talks about, the power of leaderless organizations, which seems somewhat an oxymoron for guys like me. But in fact, it's very true. And in many respects, the idea of organic groups that, come up and leaders form and then they dissipate, but you have the right people at the right time in the right place doing the right thing, and then how they work back and forth together. Very similar to network warfare, either enabling or disabling networks. Mm-hmm. I find that really interesting. A book that I read about every 3 years, I started before I was ever in the Army, because I pulled it off my dad's bookshelf, is a book called Once an Eagle by Anton Myrer, Myrer. And it's a tale, ostensibly a tale of two Army officers, Sam Damon and Courtney Massengale, whose lives intersect multiple times throughout their very lengthy careers. And it runs from really before World War I all the way into the beginnings of the Vietnam era, and both in peace and war. But it's really more of a cautionary tale about the interactions of people and both the successes and failures of people, the strengths and weaknesses of people, and loyalty and trust and distrust and personal gain and ambition and a whole host of things, and American society are all woven in there. And I only reread it, still do, even though I'm left the military, because I think it's just a really impactful book on what it means to be a person who adheres to some coda and then tries to put it into action over time. Sometimes even Sam Damon, who's, I guess ostensibly the hero, the protagonist in this case, most people like us would say, oh, he's my guy. But some of his weaknesses in there, when you really take a step back and think about it, are really fascinating. Sometimes pride and, sort of even dogged determination to do this and only this. It's interesting. We all decry Courtney Massengale as this, perfectionist, ambitious, overambitious guy. And yeah, he is. But at the same time, he's got this big strategic view of what he's trying to accomplish. And, so it's every time I read it, I come away with something different. It's always a personal conundrum. But I just think there's some really great books. I mean, I read a lot of a lot of things, and trying to dissect culture. And I don't know, those are just some that come to mind, but I would say whatever interests you, read that, and then go find something you know nothing about and read that.
Wow. That's very good advice. Very good advice. Well, before I kind of close and thank you, for our listeners, this episode is being brought to you by Genosco Consulting. And if you're facing complexity or a wicked problem, we specialize in helping you navigate that. So if you would like to reach out and need more information, you can reach out to info@Genosco, GINOSKO.co, or check us out on the web, genosco.co. Well, General Grimsley, I would not want to close without first personally thanking you as an individual, but from those of us who have served not only with you but around you, your service to our country, I don't think could be overstated. You've given so much to our country, to our institution, the United States Army. And I just want to say thank you for your lifelong dedication to our institution, our country, and those in our society. And I I admire your professional ethos and your determination to always be giving back to society in a different way. It seems like every time I get to talk to you. So thank you for that. And also just thanks for coming on and just being willing to have a conversation with me. And I hope that our listeners really got something out of our conversation today.
Well, thanks, Roy. And the same to you. And just a reminder to listeners everywhere, as we have the opportunity to do things like this and have a dialogue, and, maybe somebody will listen to it and want to do something with it. But just remember, there are thousands of young Americans, women and men, not only in our nation's uniform deployed today in harm's way, but, people working in embassies and consulates, in refugee camps, in orphanages, in Peace Corps remote locations as individuals who are out there in the world representing the best of America. There are people all over the world who don't know anything about Americans other than what they read, perhaps on the internet, and then what they see in person. And I would say that what they see in person amongst all of those people in uniform and out are the best of what makes our society who we are. And so just remember them and what they do for us all every day. So thanks.
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better. So I appreciate you coming on, taking the time today. And, if somebody wants to reach out and find out more about what you're doing, or just reach out and want to contact you, do you have a place you want them to reach out to?
Well, they can always do it through you, but email wfgrimsley@gmail.com. I answer email, and happy to do that. And if you Google me, you'll see me arm wrestling a guy in the WWE. So
that was another story, maybe for another episode sometime.
That was pretty high adventure too. So yeah.
Well, thanks again, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks to everybody. Happy holidays.
You too.